All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going pretty deep into a topic that, might sound like it's all biology, but it's
Yeah.
actually surprisingly philosophical. We're going to be talking about the philosophy of immunology.
Immunology.
Yeah.
Yeah, you think about it, and you probably think about, white blood cells fighting off infections.
Right.
But when you look deeper, it really digs into some big philosophical questions about, like, what makes you you? How do we tell the difference between self and non-self?
Yeah.
And even how a living system like your immune system actually learns and knows things.
Yeah, exactly. And, for our listeners who are into philosophy, think about it. At the most basic level, your immune system is constantly figuring out what's you and what's not you, right?
Right.
And that whole process of like biological identity, that's a huge philosophical thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's what we're going to explore today in this deep dive. We're going to be looking at the philosophy of immunology entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Great source.
And our goal is to see where this field of biology, this immunology, overlaps with these big philosophical ideas.
Yeah, I think a lot of philosophers might be surprised to learn that for a long time, immunology wasn't really looked at from a philosophical point of view. Even though it's so important for how organisms work and has a lot to do with ideas like identity and knowledge, it's only recently that philosophers have really started paying attention to it.
Okay, so let's break that down a little. For someone who's into philosophy, like what makes immunology so interesting to study?
Well, I think the philosophy of immunology gives us a totally new way to think about some of the biggest philosophical questions. Like, what is identity? What really makes an organism what it is? What about individuality? Where do we draw the line between one organism and another, especially when you think about all these symbiotic relationships out there? Then there's ecology. How do organisms interact with their environments at this really basic biological level? And then there's cognition. How does the immune system actually know what to attack and what to leave alone? And of course, there's the philosophy of science itself. How do we even begin to study something as incredibly complex as the immune system? So these are questions that aren't just about biology. They have deep philosophical roots.
Right, so it's more than just fighting off germs.
Oh,
Right?
way more.
Which is important, obviously.
It is.
But there's a much wider scope here. You mentioned host defense, but then there's transplantation. The immune system has to figure out if tissue is foreign and then reject it. Then there's autoimmunity, where the immune system attacks the body's own stuff. Tumor immunology, allergies, it's a huge range.
Yeah.
And it goes way beyond just those classic areas too, right?
Yeah, totally. Our understanding of it is still evolving, but we now know the immune system plays a big role in all kinds of basic biological processes, things like basic physiology, how our bodies work, developmental biology, even how ecological and evolutionary processes work. And the source we're looking at makes a really interesting point. A big theme running through all of this is the idea of organismal identity. That's really at the heart of why immunology is so fascinating for philosophy.
So let's dig into that a bit. Organism level functions and identity. I think most people think of the immune system as like the body's army, always on guard against threats from the outside, but it's a lot more complex than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. Defense is crucial, yeah, but it's only one part of what the immune system does. It's also involved in repairing tissues, making sure they regenerate properly. It helps keep cancer in check. It even plays a role in how we develop from an embryo into an adult. It helps with metabolism, how we process nutrients, and it helps us form those vital relationships with the trillions of microbes that live in and on us. It could even influence things like mate selection. And get this, it talks to our nervous system, impacting our moods and memory.
Wow.
So there's this constant back and forth communication between cells, showing how deeply the immune system is connected to the whole organism.
And so this raises a really fundamental philosophical question. If the immune system is doing all this, what actually makes us a distinct organism? Like what defines our identity?
Exactly. The old school view, the one from the early days of immunology, said that the immune system was mainly there to protect the organism, to maintain its individuality by fighting off anything foreign, like pathogens, anything that didn't belong. This view imagined the organism as kind of a closed system with clear boundaries.
But that simple picture starts to break down when you think about things like symbiosis, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We're not really these isolated entities. We're complex ecosystems. We have all these other organisms living inside us that we need to survive. So the idea of a clear self that the immune system is protecting gets a lot more complicated.
Totally. From an ecological point of view, the idea of individuality gets a lot more nuanced, less black and white. We form these close sometimes lifelong partnerships with other organisms. So the idea that there's a hard line between self and non-self for the immune system to defend, it just doesn't hold up as well.
And that leads us to this big philosophical problem. Diachronic identity. Basically, how do we stay the same over time when we're constantly changing? This has been a puzzle for philosophers for ages.
Yeah, for centuries. Think about Aristotle talking about substance and form, or Locke, who said that the continuity of our consciousness is what makes us the same person over time. More recently, you've got philosophers like Hull, who say that species themselves are like individuals that change over time. And then there's animalism, which focuses on the continuity of our biological makeup.
So, how does immunology fit into all of this thinking about identity over time?
Well, Burnett had this influential idea, the self-non-self model. He said that during development, the immune system learns what molecules belong to the self, and it gets rid of any immune cells that would attack those molecules. This suggested there was some kind of stable molecular essence that made the organism what it was, that stayed the same over time.
So, the immune system was like the guardian of this unchanging identity.
That was the idea. But then you have Perdue, and he proposes this different view, this idea of genidentity. He says that identity isn't about some fixed, unchanging core, but about these ongoing biochemical interactions that stay consistent over time. The immune system, in this view, is what keeps this continuity going by responding to and fixing any disruptions. So for a philosopher, this shifts the focus from a static definition of self to a much more dynamic process.
So instead of thinking about a fixed identity, we're thinking about this ongoing process of maintenance. But then the source points out that there's evidence against this idea that the immune system is just about maintaining continuity.
Right. Even back in the late 1800s, you have Metchnikoff saying that immune cells weren't just defensive, but they were actually involved in changing the organism. And more recent research backs this up. We know now that the immune system helps create changes throughout our lives. It's always adjusting what it reacts to. Think about microglia in the brain. They do all sorts of things, from helping blood vessels form to helping neurons connect. They even play a role in social and sexual identity. This shows how the immune system helps shape the organism, not just defend it.
And we can even develop tolerance to new things over time, right? So our immune system isn't just set in stone from birth. It's learning and adapting to new things it encounters.
Exactly. Our immune biography is always changing. And because of this, that simple non-self distinction starts to get blurry. It's not like we have this unchanging molecular essence that dictates all our immune responses. Instead, it's more like our identity emerges from all these changes we accept and the truly foreign things we reject. This really challenges those fixed views of diachronic identity, like the idea that we are simply defined by our unchanging physical makeup. The immune system suggests that it's more about a coordinated series of changes than a static state.
That's a pretty big shift in how we think about identity. Okay, so let's move on to synchronic identity. This is about what makes us unique individuals at a specific moment in time. Philosophers have talked about things like autonomy, how our parts work together, genetic similarity, physical boundaries. But biology, it often makes these neat definitions messy.
Oh, it does. Biological individuals are incredibly diverse. And what makes an individual, from an evolutionary perspective, like a unit that evolution acts on, might be very different from how we define an individual based on physiology, how the body works. Immunology looks at this by asking, how does the immune system decide where the boundaries of the organism are based on what it accepts and rejects at any given time?
And Perdue's discontinuity model comes in here again, right?
It does. He says that the immune system figures out what makes up the organism by reacting to temporary changes while tolerating the long-term ones. This is based on the idea that a certain level of autoimmunity, where the immune system reacts to the self, is actually normal and necessary. Our own antigens are always there, so the immune system has a kind of threshold for reaction. It mainly responds to big, rapid changes, like a new pathogen coming in.
So the fact that we tolerate things like our gut bacteria or even transplanted organs isn't a failure of the immune system. It's actually how it creates these stable and often beneficial relationships. It's almost like the immune system is actively negotiating and defining the boundaries of the individual at every moment.
That's the idea. But then you have this counter-argument. Some say that these stable interactions with our microbiome actually challenge the whole idea that we're individuals in the biological sense.
Right.
There's this concept of the holobiont, which says that an organism and its microbes are actually a single integrated unit, both ecologically and evolutionarily. This really questions the idea of a separate, independent individual. The immune system in this framework becomes a key part of this holobiont, constantly figuring out what to accept and what to reject among all these symbiotic partners.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting point for philosophers who are interested in the metaphysics of individuality.
And then there's the example of pregnancy in mammals. That really challenges this non-self idea and this isolated view of individuality, doesn't it? The fetus is genetically different from the mother, but the mother's immune system doesn't just attack it like foreign tissue.
Right, it's way more complex than that. The mother's immune system actually creates a special environment that allows the fetus to develop. New research even suggests that it's not just passive tolerance, but an active participation in what could be considered a temporary merging, a kind of combined maternal-fetal individual. The inflammation that happens when the embryo first implants, for example, seems to help create this tolerant fusion instead of triggering rejection.
So when we look at synchronic identity through the lens of immunology, we don't get a simple, clear answer. Maybe, like the source says, we're asking the wrong kind of question. We're too focused on finding a fixed definition of individuality instead of looking at how we actually study and define individuals in different biological and ecological contexts.
That's a really important point. Maybe we need to shift our focus. Instead of asking what is an individual, maybe we should ask how do we actually come to know and define an individual in a way that makes sense scientifically? And this brings us to the idea of the immune self.
The immune self. This is a huge concept in immunology, right? It's all about distinguishing between what belongs and what's foreign. But the source points out that defining this self has been surprisingly difficult.
Yeah, it really has. The self-non-self idea has been fundamental to immunology for decades. But pinning down exactly what the self is has been tricky. The immune system's activity changes so much throughout our lives that it's hard to say that the self is just whatever is tolerated at any given time. And different research approaches within immunology tend to focus on different criteria for self-recognition, so there's not really a clear consensus on a single definition.
So some people even question the whole idea of the immune self, right? They say it might just be a fancy way of saying non-reactivity.
That's one view. But people who support the concept say that it does capture the main organizing principle of the immune system, defending a relatively well-defined biological entity. They say that getting rid of the concept altogether might be a mistake. And from a philosophical perspective, Howes, who draws on the ideas of Hume, suggests that we can still have a meaningful sense of self, whether it's immunological or personal, even if it's not some fixed, unchanging thing. It can be a dynamic process of experience and interaction.
So it sounds like the immune self, even with all the debate around it, has a lot of practical value in the field. It's like a shorthand way of talking about a lot of different things that are happening in the immune system.
Exactly. It gives us a way to understand how our bodies respond to all sorts of challenges and internal states. Everything from what we eat to allergies, infections, autoimmune disorders, and even how we accept or reject transplants. By thinking about all these things in terms of selfhood, immunologists can start to see how they're all connected and how they've evolved.
And it goes beyond just science, right? The idea of the immune self has become part of how we think about ourselves and our place in society, our sense of belonging. It's a two-way street between science and culture.
For sure. The idea of an autonomous identity in immunology really fits with Western ideas of individualism, and you could argue that it reinforces those ideas. But immunology has also given us metaphors that shape how we think about agency, community, and how we deal with perceived threats in society. We'll talk more about that later.
All right, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about immune ecology. It seems like immunology is moving away from just focusing on the individual and starting to look at the bigger picture, the whole community, and the environment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just like other areas of biology are starting to think more ecologically, immunology is expanding its view beyond just the organism itself. It's starting to look at all the complex interactions happening in and around the organism. There's a growing interest in somatic evolution, which is about the changes that happen within the cells of an individual during its lifetime. Things like cancer development or how immune responses diversify. This is a shift from just thinking about defense to a broader view that includes tolerance and symbiosis as really important parts of how the immune system works.
So the immune system isn't just constantly at war, it's also playing a crucial role in all these complex relationships between different species.
Right, and the context of those relationships is what determines whether it's parasitism, commensalism, or mutualism.
And when we think about how the immune system itself evolved, there's this amazing discovery, adaptive immunity in bacteria, specifically the CRISPR system.
Yeah,
This really challenges some of the traditional ideas about inheritance.
it really does.
So let's talk more about these ecological approaches to immunity. The source mentions this really interesting idea that the cells inside an organism are organized like a society, even using terms like cell state or cell republic. That's a pretty powerful metaphor.
It is. This early idea was that the cells in a multicellular organism all work together for the good of the whole organism, like a well-functioning society. When things go wrong, it's like a conflict or even a civil war between different types of cells. This led to the idea that there's an internal struggle for existence within an individual, with cells evolving and adapting just like individual organisms do in their external environment. Mechnikov was a big proponent of this view. He saw a connection between how biological communities work at different levels of organization.
And this ecological perspective changes how we think about immunity and identity, right?
It does.
It's not about the static, isolated individual anymore. It's about these dynamic relationships and how everything depends on the context.
Exactly. Our cells and all the microbes living with us are constantly communicating and exchanging information. This view kind of breaks down some of the old categories we used to think about in immunology, like the difference between tolerance and response, or self and non-self. It all becomes more fluid, more about information and ecology. And a great example of this is interkingdom signaling, where microbes and their hosts can actually communicate with each other, even though they're from totally different evolutionary branches. It's like bridging these seemingly separate systems, like the immune system, the epithelial system, and the nervous system.
So this complex interface between us and all the microbes living in and on us, it's not just a battleground.
Well,
It's more like an ecological ecotone, a dynamic zone where there's this constant dialogue going on. It creates all sorts of new possibilities for adaptation, both for us and for the microbes.
exactly. And then you have this concept of niche construction, where microbes and their hosts shape their shared environment together. This leads to the development of these integrated units called holobionts. This even challenges the old idea of a pathogen being inherently bad. Instead, whether a microbe causes disease actually depends on the specific interactions with the host and the environment. The lines between parasitism, commensalism, and mutualism become blurry. It's all about this balance, this equilibrium between the microbe and the host.
Okay, so now let's think about how studying the immune system can actually teach us about evolution on a larger scale.
One of the things it teaches us about is how traits are passed down through generations. There's growing evidence that some of these changes aren't random, that they're influenced by the environment. Things like stress-induced mutagenesis, where stress can actually cause changes in DNA, or epigenetic inheritance, where traits can be passed down without changes to the DNA sequence itself. This suggests that organisms might have ways to actively adapt to their environment and pass those adaptations onto their offspring. And this brings up the idea of Lamarckian inheritance, the idea that acquired traits can be inherited.
Which, as we know, has been a pretty controversial topic in biology,
Yeah.
especially with the dominance of the neo-Darwinian view, which focuses on random mutation and natural selection as the main drivers of evolution.
Yeah, but then we discovered the CRISPR-Cas system in prokaryotes, and it really complicated things. This is a type of adaptive immunity where bacteria can actually incorporate pieces of viral DNA into their own genomes. It's like creating a memory of past infections that helps them target similar viruses in the future. This is a direct, non-random response to a specific threat from the environment. And these acquired changes can be passed down to future generations, leading some to argue that this is a Lamarckian mechanism at work. Though, of course, there's still debate about that.
And it's not just in the microbial world. The adaptive immune system in vertebrates also has some features that don't fit neatly into the strictly neo-Darwinian model, like the directed mutagenesis and gene rearrangements that happen in lymphocytes.
Right. Our adaptive immune system is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It can generate a huge diversity of antibodies and T-cell receptors. But this isn't a completely random process. There's a lot of directedness involved, where these receptors are selected and refined based on the specific antigens the organism encounters. And then you have ecological inheritance, things like mothers passing on antibodies to their offspring, or the mother playing a crucial role in shaping the baby's microbiome. This transmission of environmental influences and biological resources across generations definitely shapes how the offspring can adapt. If these ecological inheritance mechanisms get disrupted, it can even have big consequences for the offspring's health and development.
So, immunology is making us rethink these traditional categories of Darwinian and Lamarckian inheritance.
Yeah,
It's suggesting that evolution might be more complex and nuanced than we thought.
for sure.
And then there's the clonal selection theory, which is central to how we understand immunology today. It's actually contributed to a broader understanding of the principle of selection itself, not just in immunity, but in other biological systems too.
Absolutely. The clonal selection theory says that the immune system basically uses a process like natural selection to find and multiply lymphocytes that have the right receptors to recognize specific antigens. This idea of selection within an organism has been applied to other areas of biology too, like how neural connections in the brain are formed and refined. It suggests that there might be this more fundamental principle of selection at play across different complex systems.
Let's move on to how we think about immunological knowledge. How does studying the immune system help us understand how scientific models and theories are built in biomedicine in general?
Immunology gives us a lot of great examples to study how scientific knowledge is created and organized. For example, the philosopher Science Schaffner used the development of the clonal selection theory and the two-component theory of the immune response to argue that science often works with what he calls middle-range theories. These are like networks of models that are all connected to each other. And immunology itself uses a whole bunch of different methods and theoretical approaches. And now we have high-throughput sequencing and systems biology, which bring in these engineering ideas like feedback loops, redundancy, modularity, and stability as ways to understand why the immune system is so robust and resilient.
Immunology has also been important in developing these cognitivist models in biology. The idea that the immune system is like a perceptive or cognitive system.
Oh, absolutely. Immunologists use a lot of language that sounds cognitive. We talk about macrophages seeing and engulfing antigens, antibodies recognizing specific molecules, the immune system remembering past encounters and learning to respond better next time. This idea that the immune system is like a kind of mind processing information has become really popular in biology. It's even been applied to bacteria and cancer cells.
And that leads to some really interesting philosophical questions about intentionality, the role of representation in biology, and what cognition even means when it's not happening in the brain.
Yeah, for sure. Using cognitive models in immunology can bring new life to debates in cognitive science. It gives us an example of a system that adapts and learns through all these probabilistic interactions between individual components. It's like a distributed cognition, or what some call a fluid brain. Some even say there are similar organizational principles between the nervous system and the immune system, like the ability to process information in parallel and integrate different signals. This idea of a psychoneuroendocrine immune system shows how connected these systems are and how we're using similar models to understand them.
But when we say the immune system intends to destroy a pathogen or recognizes a dangerous molecule, do we really mean that? Like, is there actual biological intentionality, or is this just a convenient way of talking about complex processes without saying that cells have minds?
That's the big debate around this cognitive view of the immune system. Some philosophers and scientists say that this intentional language is just a tool, a convenient way to understand things that we could eventually replace with something more precise. Some even say it's misleading and we should get rid of it altogether. But others say that this language is necessary, especially when we're talking about things like autoimmunity, where the immune system seems to have this misdirected intentionality attacking the self. Even if it's just a heuristic, a way to guide our thinking, these psychological metaphors seem to play a really important role in how we understand the immune system and come up with new research questions. And as the source points out, metaphors in science aren't just fancy words. They can actually be really important for how scientific knowledge develops.
Let's dig a little deeper into these representational models of immune cognition. This idea that the immune system is like a knower that creates internal representations of the world outside. What does that mean for how we think about self and individuality in immunology?
It's really central to how we understand those concepts. This separation of subject and object, where the immune system is seen as an active agent that creates internal models of its environment, is the basis for a lot of our thinking about self, individuality, and the organism as a whole in immunology. Agency in this view isn't about conscious decision-making, but about the ability of the immune system to start and control immune responses to perceived threats or changes. Even though there's no central control center like a brain, the immune system can effectively image its surroundings through all these different receptors and then act on those images. This leads to the idea that immune agency is something that emerges from the coordinated behavior of individual cells, which are like tiny cellular computing machines.
Okay, so now let's compare that to the non-representational models that have been proposed. These models challenge that whole subject-object way of thinking, right?
They do. The immune network theory, which was championed by Niels Journey, proposed a pretty radical shift. It said we should move from an antigen-centered to an organism-centered immunology, one that doesn't need internal representations or a central control system. Journey's idea was that antibodies don't just recognize foreign antigens, they also recognize each other, forming this huge dynamic network within the organism. In this model, antigens from the outside world are just disturbances that disrupt the balance of this internal network. So cognition isn't about representing the outside world anymore. It's all about the internal dynamics of the network itself. There's no central immune agent, no need for internal models of the external world. Immune knowledge becomes about the meaning that arises from the relationships within the network, not about representing things outside the organism.
That's a pretty big change from the traditional view. But the source mentions that Jern's theory had some problems, right? It wasn't fully supported by experiments.
Yeah, while it was shown that antibodies can interact with each other, it wasn't totally clear how important those interactions were for the whole immune system. And the idea of a completely closed network didn't really fit with all the evidence showing that the immune system can respond to new challenges from the environment. But the idea that complex biological systems can have a kind of cognition without a central agent or explicit representations, that was a really influential idea. Another example of a non-representational model is Purdue's continuity theory. It focuses on how stable connections are formed between antigens and immune receptors. Tolerance, in this view, is about maintaining those stable connections, while immune activation happens when those connections are broken.
So instead of specific receptors recognizing specific molecules, it's the whole system responding together to maintain a kind of molecular balance within the organism.
Exactly. And then there's presentational cognition, which takes this non-representational view even further. It says that the immune system directly sees or interacts with the world without creating internal models.
Directly sees. That sounds almost intuitive, maybe even metaphorical, rather than a strict mechanistic explanation.
Well, it's not mystical or purely metaphorical. It's based on Gibson's ecological psychology. The idea is that the immune system has these built-in perceptual systems that are tuned to specific types of input from the environment. Information isn't something out there that needs to be encoded or represented internally. It emerges from these meaningful interactions that happen because the system is already designed to respond to certain types of stimuli. So there's no separate observer or interpreter. The system is directly engaged with its environment. I think about things like insect colonies or bacterial biofilms. They exhibit these complex, seemingly coordinated behaviors without a central control system. Perception in this view is about directly interacting with the environment, not about computation or internal models.
So again, we have a model that doesn't need a central processor or a traditional stimulus response system. Immune knowledge isn't located in a specific place. It's embedded in the dynamics of the whole system. It's almost like the immune system only knows itself through these interactions.
Exactly. And this has big implications for how we think about the self in immunology. It moves away from the idea of a rigidly defined self-contained entity and towards a view of the self as this distributed system of information processing, characterized by these dynamic patterns of interaction that don't need a central controller or an internal observer.
This is really challenging some fundamental assumptions about how we know and perceive things. So now let's briefly touch on this debate between reductionism and holism in immunology. It seems like this field, being so complex, is a really interesting case study for this philosophical discussion about how we should study complex systems.
It is. Immunology has all these interacting parts and emergent properties that force us to think about how we explain biological phenomena. This shift from an individual-centered view of immunity to a more ecological view is pushing us towards a more holistic approach. And this contrasts with the more reductionist approaches that have been common in molecular immunology. This tension has real practical consequences for how research is done and what kinds of concepts we use in the field.
We've seen similar debates in other areas of biology, too, like the historical tension between classical genetics and molecular biology, or in neuroscience and systems biology today. So immunology gives us another way to think about these big philosophical questions about how to understand living systems.
Yeah, exactly. There are different philosophical models of reduction, but in immunology, there's often this feeling that trying to explain everything just by looking at individual molecules isn't enough. People who favor a holistic view of immunology argue that we need approaches that take into account the complexity of the system, integrating the molecular details with how things work at the cellular, tissue, and even organismal level. This fits with a broader trend in philosophy of biology today that emphasizes how important it is to have different disciplines working together to solve complex biological problems.
The source talks about this historical competition between more reductionist research agendas, like the immune chemical program in the early 20th century, and more holistic organism-based views, like those championed by Metchnikoff.
Right. In the early 1900s, there was this big push to explain immunity using chemistry and physics. Later, with the big discoveries about antibody genetics, immunology became more focused on molecular biology. But alongside this reductionist trend, you had influential researchers like Metchnikoff and Burnett arguing for more holistic perspectives. They stressed the importance of cells, how they interact, and the broader evolutionary and ecological context. Burnett, in particular, tried to bring together these molecular mechanisms with broader ideas like adaptation and natural selection.
And more recently, there's been this effort to bridge the gap between reductionism and holism with the rise of systems biology.
Yeah, definitely. People realized that just focusing on individual molecules wasn't enough to understand how the immune system works as a whole, especially in areas like vaccine development. Systems biology uses these powerful computational tools and theoretical frameworks like dynamical systems theory and network analysis to put together data and insights from different levels of biological organization. The goal is to have a more inclusive approach that looks at both the molecular details and the big picture emergent properties of the system. But actually modeling the immune system as a whole, especially with all the data we have now, is still a huge challenge, both technically and conceptually.
Finally, let's talk about the social aspects of immunology. It seems like the way we understand our immune systems is tied up with our cultural values and beliefs.
Well, it definitely is. The way we use this anti-foreign language in this central idea of self, non-self in immunology is a great example of how science and society are connected. This dominant model, where the body is like a fortress constantly under attack from outsiders, really resonated with 19th century Western ideas about the individual in economics, politics, and medicine.
And this idea of a clearly defined organism with a clear separation between self and non-self aligns with a very specific Western cultural understanding of personal identity.
Right. Studies have shown that other cultures often have different ideas about the self, ideas that are more fluid and focus more on interconnectedness. And the emphasis on individualism in Western societies in the mid-20th century reinforced this isolated view of the immune self, which then influenced how we think about identity in psychology and philosophy.
But cultural critics have also pointed out that these ideas about autonomy and immunology reflect anxieties about boundaries becoming blurred, about the body being a site of conflict. The way we use military metaphors to talk about the immune system is especially interesting.
Yeah, the language of attack, defense, invaders, it really highlights this separation between self and other, this focus on rejection over acceptance or integration. Some social theorists even say that the immune self is a metaphor for how post-industrial societies work, with the idea of immunization being applied to how we manage perceived threats in general. This metaphorical way of thinking then spreads to other areas of social and political thought.
And it's not just one way, right? Scientific ideas don't just flow from science to society. They get transformed and reinterpreted by culture, and then those culturally shaped ideas can come back and influence how science is done and how results are interpreted.
Absolutely. In the past, debates about tissue incompatibility and transplantation often reflected existing social hierarchies and prejudices. Even Burnett, with his own strong beliefs, including what he called a harmless terror of strangers, seemed to be influenced by those beliefs when he developed his scientific concepts about self and non-self. Ultimately, the images and ideas we use in immunology reflect the values and tensions of our culture, especially around the relationship between the individual and society. This shows how hard it is to separate science from the culture it's embedded in.
So this has been a really deep dive into the philosophy of immunology. Just to sum up, we've talked about two big shifts in the field. First, moving away from the simple idea of lock and key specificity to a more nuanced understanding of how molecules interact in complex ways. And second, shifting from this view of the organism as isolated to a more ecological perspective that emphasizes all these relationships between different species.
And these shifts are challenging the old self-not-self framework that's been so dominant in immunology. They're pushing us towards more complex models that take into account the context of these interactions. The big philosophical question of defining immune identity is all about this tension between the idea of an autonomous, contained individual, and the reality that organisms are actually dynamic and interconnected collectives.
As we've seen, immunology raises all these big philosophical questions. What is immunity really? What does it mean to be an individual from an immunological perspective? How do we know about the immune self, and what are the limitations of that concept? How does thinking about the